Lieutenant Kage has survived some adventures. In the first book, the last chancers are thousands of penal soldiers that get whittled down to just a few so that they can destroy Port Norum. Lieutenant Kage gets his redemption. He gets his last chance, but he squanders it, and so he is sent back into the last chancers in the second book. In the second book, Colonel Schaefer tells him that he will get to participate in another mission, and he's happy. He starts training the next crew, but he suffers from this strange PTSD sort of thing. And so the colonel decides that he is no longer fit to be on the mission. He still is a part of the mission. He ends up hijacking a shuttle and changing the colonel's mind, as Inquisitor Oriel is suitably impressed with him. I believe so far there's only two last chancers that got redemption. That was Strelly and Tanya. So they actually survived when really no one else did besides Kage. And that's kind of like Cage's ability. That's his superpower, right? Is the plot armor. And that's just it. He and Schaefer and Oriel all have plot armor. They have such a dense web of plot armor. And the book does a pretty good job of just explaining it that quickly. And so I kind of enjoy that deliberation because they're not pretending anything else. It's straightforward. The Immaterium, warp space. It is a seething mass of roiling emotive energies, a kaleidoscope of colors and textures that reflect mankind's passions and fears. Sharp red waves of anger crash against blue whirlpools of despondency and soft purple clouds of passion. It is scattered with flickering pinpricks of white, a firmament of souls, the spirits of the living that resemble tiny stars of energy, minuscule, fleeting and soon forgotten. Here and there, like a candle in an insane wilderness of crashing colors, burns the soul of a psyker. The turmoil feeds its fire, giving it strength. Through the tempest of feelings surges a ship, its harsh lines obscured by a miasma of fluctuating forces. Its jellar field pushes back the burning energies of the warp. Its eagle-beaked prow tears through hope and despair. The stubby wing shapes of its launch bays cut across love and hate, leaving wispy trails of rage and disappointment. Behind the ship drifts a shadow, an empty tide of nothingness that consumes the disturbed energies and feeds upon them. The cloud is more than a shadow. It is a shoal of emptiness made from thousands of warp entities, demonic sharks of the Immaterium, that prey upon the energy of mortals. They gather around the ship. Flickers of protective power flash along its length as they attempt to break through. But they are flung back by the psychic shield. The Geller field brightens and dims under the assault of the demonic creatures. Its power waxes and wanes. Around the vortices of its warp engines, a brief tear opens, and the energy of chaos seeps in. A lone shadow flitting through the momentary break in the warding fields. It passes effortlessly through the steel hull of the ship, seeking a host. It can feel its life force dripping away, leached from its invisible incorporeal form. Now that it is cut off from the substance of warp space, it slips into a wide, low chamber, its unreal eyes spying the sleeping forms of humans. They look like gray, flat silhouettes. Their life force is weak, lacking in nourishment. A freezing black hole engulfs one of the rough pallets, and the demon veers away, terrified of the shadow that could consume it. It then detects warmth, a glow of power. From further up the chamber, drawn instinctively towards the power source, it speeds up, flitting back and forth, basking in the heat, coiling around itself. It luxuriates on the sensation before dissolving itself into the energy until its whole being is fully encompassed. Warp dreams. It's a dream, a nightmare, in fact. I can tell because I know I went to sleep on my bunk as normal, wrapped in a thin gray blanket. And there's no other way I could have ended up plummeting down a chasm into a roaring inferno. But it's not really a nightmare because I'm calm about the whole thing. I should have been terrified as I plunged down to the fiery depths, falling through smoke, my skin burning from my flesh, the flesh blowing away from my bones as ash. It's a warp dream, horribly real in every sensation, more lifelike than the warp itself. Than life itself. Everything is sharper, clearer, and more bright and focused. Through eyeballs that have long since exploded into steam, I can see the cracks and crannies of the chasm wall. A small red eye peering back at me through the fumes. The wind that screams into my cindered ears is sharp and loud, the flames that lick up from below, bursting forth from a river of boiling magma, are searing hot. So why is there no pain? Why am I not afraid? I don't feel as if I'm dying, just changing. I was once a clumsy, pain-ridden, emotional husk of a body, but now I am unfettered by its restrictions, and my soul is allowed to burst free. Wings erupt from my back, and suddenly I'm soaring through the thermals, swooping and diving amongst the rising flames. I laugh, though there is no sound. I delight in the freedom, the ease of movement as I climb upwards through the smoke, and then kick my legs back and dive headfirst towards the inferno. The heat washes over me like a soft caress. The blistering heat is like the warm touch of a lover awakening me. It feels beautiful, and I feel beautiful to be experiencing it. And then something shudders within me. Something casts me free in the same way that I freed my own body. It takes my wings with it and soars up out of sight, leaving me falling towards the flames. The terror starts then. It wells up from the pit of my stomach, and a scream is wrenched from my lips. My horror bursts in a wordless screech as the heat blisters my entire being. Unimaginable pain infuses me. Every fiber of my soul suffers vibrant agony. Perhaps this is damnation. Maybe this is the abyssal chaos that I am doomed to be thrown into once my mortal life is ended. To know joy, liberty, and to have it taken away as I am damned for my sins. That is true torture. I awake with sweat coating my body. With a shuddering gasp, I take in a lungful of the warm, stale ship's air. I hate warp dreams. This one has been plaguing me for several weeks, though it's the first time I've had the sensation of fear. Usually it ends up with me soaring majestically out of the chasm and disappearing into a halo of pure light. Reality crashes into my senses, and for a moment I feel a disassociation with everything around me. For a split second, it feels like I'm watching it from behind my own eyes, and then everything feels normal again. The bunk throbs with the vibrations that come from the ship's deck. The air is filled with a steady humming from the machinery that keeps us alive in this hostile environment. The snores and heavy breathing of the other last chancers accompanies the relentless droning of the ship's systems. And I sit up and listen, trying to detect some oddity, some change in the eternal harmony that would have awoken me. It all sounds normal, though. I thought perhaps we might have dropped from the warp. After all, we might be somewhere near our destination. I've been traveling for nearly a year now, a single, long, virtually impossible warp jump. I'd never heard of such a thing before. I didn't even know it was possible. Usually a ship will jump into warp space for a short time, and then jump back into the real galaxy a week, or perhaps a month later. Ships that jump further get lost, or are destroyed. I've heard tales of ships that got caught in warp storms only to emerge 500 years later, their crews aged by just a few months. I've also heard of ships that have disappeared for only a week or two, and then are found drifting, the crew nothing but ashes, the ship's logs showing they all died of old age. Getting Given a choice, I'd rather not travel in the warp. The strange dreams aside, it has got to be one of the most dangerous things a man can do. But I don't have the choice, do I? I'm a soldier in the Last Chancers, known as the 13th Penal Legion to everyone else. We're all here because we deserve to be. Each one of the 30 people sharing this chamber with me is being punished for their crimes. I murdered my sergeant because of a woman. Topaz, which lies to my life, is a thief who stole from the officer's mess of her regiment. Kage, the bearded man to my right, hung his own squad for supposed insubordination. Looters, heretics, mass murderers, rapists, thieves, and all the other scum of the Imperial Guard end up here, doomed to spend their short lives fighting to their grisly deaths in battle. Well, most of them are. We're different. We're Last Chancers. Our commander, the Ice Guard, Colonel Schaefer, has other plans for us. We've got one mission, and that's it. It'll be tantamount to suicide, mark my words, and there'll be some who'll wish they'd chosen the firing squad or Hangman's company before we see the thing through. Death is almost as certain this way as it is on the executioner's list. But we're here because we're too good to waste. We're prime meat for the grinder that is the Imperium's wars. We're specialists, survivors, experts in our fields. And that means the Colonel has chosen to give us our last chance. If we finish the mission, we're free to go, pardoned of all our crimes, our souls absolved of our sins, so that we might once again be part of the glorious Imperium of the immortal Emperor of Terror. Except me, of course. Even amongst the miscreants and frag-headed stains on humanity, I'm even more special. I'm the Last Chancer who never got away. I'm too stubborn to die, but I'm too mean to stay out of trouble. I'm useful for the Colonel to have around, for sure. And though I used to make his life hell and cause him no end of trouble, I've kind of got over that now. I'm just like the lifers and the other penal legions, except that by following the Colonel, I'll see more fighting, more danger, and more ways to end up dead than any long-serving veteran in any other regiments. I had my last chance and blew it. Now I have to live with it. The lights flicker on to show it's now morning on the ship time. Obviously, it's all artificial, and I swear the Colonel makes the days longer and longer so that we have to work harder. I know I did when he trusted me with training his last squad. That didn't go so well in the end. So, although I'm still Lieutenant Kage, the rank is more honorary than it ever was. The others begin to wake. The chamber is filled with groaning, yawning, stretching, and farting. And another day begins. Our days start with a slop spilling contest that passes for breakfast, and a compulsory punch up between Kian and Glabrand over the seat nearest the heaters. On the way out, I count the cutlery, including the spoons, to make sure nobody smuggled out anything that could be used as a weapon. It's bad enough that we give them guns to train with. Who knows what they'd do if we let them loose with a fork? After we've all completed the cautious obstacle course, there's a spin around the ablution block. It's back to the bump rooms to see who's stolen what last night. Topaz has managed to acquire himself a half a field rations pack, which nobody owns up to owning since we're not supposed to have any. A spare heel from a boot, 2 decks of playing cards, and a small ball of string. After a year, everyone sleeps with their meager valuables, the odd brooch, chain, or ring, on their person or under their pillow. During the theft inspection, Goran and Venskin get into a fight, and Goran wins hands down because he's a big brute of a man. I send Venskin down to the med bay to see if it's worth getting his ear stitched back on. After this, and the odd argument, scuffle, or backbiting comment, I lead the platoon down the small storage room to gear up for training. 2 commissariat provosts, even meaner and leaner than the Navy armsmen, guard the door to the armory. They eye us through the black-tinted visors of their helms, shotguns held across the carapace armor on their chests. Anyone would think we were a bunch of criminals that might try and take over the ship. Nobody's had that idea since Walken got his head blown off by these 2 about 6 months ago. I give them a wave, no reaction. Behind his worn counter sits Erasmus. His bespectacled eyes peer at us across his store's ledger. His quill skull hovers over his left shoulder. He's not the fattest man I've seen, but there's a definite softness to him, like butter that's been left out too long and is starting to melt. His small, fidgety hands play with the corners of the ledger. I notice that his nails are caked in grease and his fingertips smeared with red ink. He smiles at me as I walk in. Lieutenant Kage, how are you? Asks his thin, stammering voice. What'll it be today? Close quarters? Knives and bayonets? Or perhaps rifle drill? Or maybe heavy weapons training? I still have that fastest pattern grenade launcher for you to try out. But you're not interested in that, are you? Erasmus, or Munitorium Armor Scribe Spooge, as he is known officially, has a way of making every sentence a question. I have no idea how he does it, or even if he's aware of it, but it's impossible for him to make a statement. Grenades and demolitions, dummies only, I tell him, and his smile turns to a pout. Dummies, he says. No live charges? How will your men learn if they use decoys and dummies all the time? I mean, I know there was that poor business with Morgan the other week, but do you think the others will stop being so sloppy if they're using dummies? The poor business he's referring to is the premature detonation of a faulty grenade Erasmus had supplied. Stephen Morgan, a first-class soldier as far as I could tell, accepting his predilection for finding alcohol everywhere and anywhere and being drunk on watch, was blown into so many pieces it took 4 servitors to clean up the mess. I've got another scar on my ripped-up face as a memorial to his bloody death. The only other thing that marks the occasion is a small entry into the ledger. I can't read much, but knowing the Departamento Monitorium, it probably says something like grenade, fragmentation, Mark 32, faulty, item unavailable for inspection. Dummy charges and frag grenades, I tell him. He looks at me and nods before whispering something to this quill skull. It hovers over his shoulder, the polished bone gleaming in the yellow light of the storeroom. A dipping pin extends from its whirring innards. The scuttlebutt maintains that the skull is actually from Spooge's father, who died in service to the Monitorium. And Erasmus inherited the position, along with his father's skull, of course, now refitted as an autoscribe. As Erasmus's promptings continued, it scribbles squarely across the ledger, leaving dribbly blots as it goes, little wisps of smoke bubbling from its machinery-filled eyes. When it's finished, Erasmus gives it an affectionate pat. It returns to its position, hovering just above the armor scribe's shoulder. Please wait while your munitions are being prepared. If you don't mind. One of the provosts opens the armory door, and I see a servitor tottering away behind the racks on 6 skeletal artificial legs. Its arms have been replaced with a lifting hoist. Scrapping and clanking, it works its way across the shelves, picking out crates and canisters. It loads them to the flatbed back of another servitor, doubled up under a heavy plate. There are tracks where its legs had been, which grind across the floor. Its withered arms are bound across sagging breasts. Life support tubes have been driven into its ribcage. The monotonous hissing of artificial lungs reverberate through the air. Drool hangs from its slack lips. The servitor's blank eyes look straight through us as it trundles out of the door, coming to a halt just in front of me. Load up, I tell the squad, trying not to wonder who the servitor was before she was changed, or what affront against the machine god she could have committed to earn the wrath of the tech priest. Geared up, we make our way through the ship, passing through humid, pipe-filled corridors above the engine rooms to the training deck. It was a loading bay once, but as it is the largest space on the cramped ship, it was turned over to a more useful purpose. 75 meters long and 25 meters wide, it's just about big enough to be a firing range, as well as a drill square. We ripped out most of the cranes and other machinery to make more space, dumping them before we jumped into warp space. With the help of the tech priests, we kept a couple rigged up for moving heavier objects around. They're useful for days like today. Get the tank ready, I say, and the squad falls out to their assigned positions. A year in the warp and drill every single day. They must have done this 50 times already. Still, no soldier is happy unless there's someone shouting at them. So 3 sergeants, Blurs, Candlerick, and Fikar, oblige. The tank was devised by the colonel, made from welded together packing crates and bits of old machinery. It's a blocky, square replica of a real tank, complete with turret and gun made from old cable pipe. We moved a set of rails we had previously run into one of the side chambers so that they stretched for 3/4 the length of the training hall. During pulled along the rails by a loading winch, the tank can actually pick up a good speed for about 20 meters. We also have a dummy aeroplane made of wood 30 meters up in the overhanging gantries, which we can use to simulate an enemy strafing run. The air in the chamber is sweaty and thick with grease as the platoon gets to work hoisting the tank along the rails and hitching up the winch. Almost half the air filters in the ship have now broken down, and the air is becoming so stale it's difficult to breathe. Schaefer typically sees it as part of the training. Good for working at altitude, he says. I don't mind it at all. In fact, it's almost welcoming. It reminds me of the rank atmosphere of the high factories from my home on Olympus. I grew up breathing oil and stinking of sweat. We are foreshadowing. I think we're about 5 or 6 pages into the book, and we already have 2 major foreshadows and a colonel. With a tank rigged up to go, the platoon falls in again. They stand to attention, to varying degrees, as I walk along the length of the lines. Squad 1, fall out for tank operation, I order, stepping out in front of them. Squad 2, demolitions detail, escarpment setting. The 2 nominated squads run to their positions, while a third strolls over to the wall to watch the proceedings. On the mesh floor, we painted outlines of different terrains. In red, there's a 3-way junction in an urban area. In green, a clearing in a forest. And in yellow, a defilade made through a mountain valley. All perfect sites for infantry to ambush a tank. Sergeant Candlerick stands by the winch, looking at me for the command, while Sergeant Blurs details the squad for mock attack, positioning themselves behind the outlines of rocks and in small crevices in the valley walls. I like Blurs. He's a barrel-chested man with a thick mustache and very much a traditionalist. I cause him a few problems, though, because in his experience in the Imperial Guard is run by NCOs by himself, while officers are just around to make sure everything looks nice. In his regiment, the 38th Cordian Light Infantry, he was used to the officers just giving him the nod and expecting him to sort everything out. Then he had gone too far and anticipated the orders of his captain, one time too many, leading an attack against the traitor camp. It would have gone good if the captain had not already ordered an artillery strike a few minutes later, so that half of Blurs's platoon was blown apart by their own gunners' shells. Blurs was thrown into the brig. He carries a shrapnel scar across his chin. Despite that, he still retains an ingrained respect for the officer class. I simply don't fit into that mold. I'm vicious, dirty, cunning, and I know exactly what I'm talking about. I've been in the last Chancers for 5 years now. I'm perfect sergeant material as far as he's concerned. But the lieutenant cap confuses him. I give the signal, and the winch grinds into life with a throaty growl, hauling the tank forward. Candlerick ups the gear, and the tank lumbers forward quicker as it enters the defile of the ambush site. Blurs gives a nod to his demo man, who rolls out in front of the tank with a dummy charge clasped under his chest. He waits for it to pass over. The magnetic charge clings to the underside of the tank as it continues, and I count for a 5-second timer. Detonation! I hear Candlerick. I bellow, and detonation! I bellow, and Candlerick kills the winch, bringing the tank to a halt. Within a second, the assault squads are out of their hiding places, leaping into the immobilized tank. They tear open mock hatches and drop their frag grenades in the interior before jumping again. Emperor's teeth? What do you call that? I shout at the squad as I stride down the hall towards them, stepping over the winch chain to march up to Blur's. Fall them in, Sergeant. Blur shouts them into line. And then 10 of them stand there, looking straight ahead, avoiding my gaze. I can feel the smirks of the other 2 squads behind me. The bearable thing about being bawled out by an officer is watching it happen to someone else. Not me, though. I turn to Fikar's squad, lounging by the wall. Trooper Cardinal, what did Squad 2 do wrong? I ask. The man looks at me, as if caught in a sniper scope. His thin smile turns into a look of horror, and sweat beads in his thinning hair. Sir? He asks, glancing left and right, seeking inspiration. Surely you realized that Trooper Dunmore exposed himself too early, I say, referring to the guardsman who had placed the charge. Yes, sir, replies Cardinal, licking his lips nervously. The driver should have seen him and had been able to take action, sir. Don't lie to me, Cardinal, I rage, storming back up the chamber towards him. Trooper Dunmore timed his attack perfectly. Suspended rations for you today, Trooper Cardinal. The rest of the squad piled in too soon. What do they get, Fletchson? I do not know, sir, snaps the burly corporal, staring blankly ahead. Stupid, fat, someone starts to mutter, but he or she falls silent as I pass my gaze along the line. That's a tank, and the Emperor's name, containing an engine and shells, I say, and I see realization dawns on the corporal. Secondary explosion, sir, the corporal says. Squad 2 failed to wait and see if the charge set anything else off, sir. That's right, I say, turning and waving a finger to Blurs. Squad 1, on the winch. Squad 3, ambushing in a town. Squad 5 car, I want Trooper Cardinal on the demo charge, seeing as he is such an expert. I'm kind of glad that Kage is over his angsty rebellion phase. It made the other books interesting, and it makes him different than just like Rambo. It make the difference between Guardsman Kage and Guardsman Marbo is the fact that Kage is just an insubordinate criminal, or he was before. He was before, but now he's a good old boy, and I'm okay with that. I'm totally okay with that because it's his character development. Yeah, he develops as a character in the beginning because he becomes the last chancer, and that's a big deal because all his friends are dead, and after that he realizes he can never have friends again. In the second book, he gets that like battle psychosis thing, and that really bothers him a lot. It doesn't come up later. I think it only comes up like a few times. So I guess he was just lucky it didn't happen. Or maybe it did happen at some point, and I don't know. It wasn't that important. In this book, he definitely changes. This is how he changes for the good, and then he changes for the worse, and then he changes for the best. And this is all foreshadowed. Good job, Gab Thorpe. I bagged on you for a little bit for a while, but I can tell that this third one is already greater than the sum of its parts. After 4 more hours of training with the dummy tank, during which I suspended rations for another 3 of the platoon because they got into a fight with each other, we returned the dummy charges and grenades, and then retired back to the ablutions chamber to clean up for lunch. Responsibility for cooking is shared between the 3 squads, with Blur's unit on food detail today. Not that it takes much, opening ration packets of dried rations, boiling them in water. That's been reclaimed, Emperor knows how many times in the last year. I elbow my way into a space on the cramped bench with Candlerick's squad, who are tucking into the reconstituted slop. With little vigor, I spoon the gruel in without ceremony, noting that it tastes of salt and not much else. The corporal, Festal Kindrug, catches my eye, and I give him a nod to speak. I can't see how this anti-tank training will be much use, sir, he says, waving his spoon around. How so? I ask. Infantry support, Fest says, putting the spoon down. No tank commander is going to roll into a town or forest without infantry. We would never go in with just a tank. I look at him for a moment, and then at the rest of the squad. You were a drop trooper, right? I say, and he nods. He was one of the elite 1st Company of the 33rd Kator Gravshoot Regiment, in fact. He led an unauthorized landing to loot a town behind enemy lines after it had been abandoned in advance of an orc attack. Used to operating behind the lines then? Yeah, I'm trained as a pathfinder, he says with a shrug. What of it? So you're trained in sabotage, guerrilla activity, and the like, I ask, and he nods again. What do you think we are going to be doing? I don't know, Festal says with a shake of his head. The colonel hasn't breathed a word about it. That's right, I say, finishing off the gruel and dropping the spoon into the bowl with a clatter. I don't know what we're up to either. But I bet my life it's something secretive. Not on the front line, where tanks and infantry move together, but behind them, on tracks and roads, waylaying conveyors and such. You can't know that for sure, says Girder, another member of the squad. From what you've told us, we could be doing anything. For all we know, we could be on mine clearance or anything. Don't talk nonsense, says Candlerick, slapping a meaty hand on the table. I'm not as sharp as some here, but I know you don't ship 30 men across the stars like this just to clear a minefield. From what Lieutenant Kage has said, we'll be up to our necks in it. And no mistaken. Have you not had anything from the colonel? No hints at all? No mention of any particular type of training? Says Festal, leaning forward to talk quietly. I lean forward and whisper in his ear. Nothing, I say, sitting back. He gives me a scowl, and I smile at him. When the colonel wants us to know where we're going and why we're in such a hurry, he'll tell us. I've learned not to worry about it too much. It's all the same. One way or another, we're going to be up to our necks and cack in blood. And before it's over, most of us will be dead. They look at me for a long moment. What? What'd I say? Haven't you been listening to me? You're in the last chancers now. And when all's said and done, we don't have much of a chance. There have been survivors, says Girder, glancing to the table to the left where Laurie is sitting with Blur's squad. We might get through this. How long have you been following the colonel, eh? I follow his gaze and look back at him, resting my elbows on the table. I staple my fingers against my chin. The difference being, Trooper Girder, is that I'm invincible, I say. What have you got going for you? He frowns and says nothing, turning his attention to the last few scraps of gruel in his bowl. The others glance at me as I stand up and step over the bench. Inspection in 1 hour, I remind them. Full kit for the colonel, right? They nod and mutter as I turn away. As I walk into the central corridor and turn left towards the wardroom where the colonel's made his lair, I feel a twinge of pain in the back of my head, knowing what's coming. I quickly make my way to the ablutions chambers, closing myself in one of the small cubicles there. The pain extends forward, growing in intensity as it reaches my eyes. It feels like my brain is on fire. The off white walls start to blur and dance in front of me, like pale flames. My ears are filled with the thunderous beating of my heart. I fall to my knees, my senses flaring with agony, and retch into the toilet bowl. The roar of my heart turns into a drumbeat, before rising in volume to become like the deafening pounding of an artillery barrage in my ears. I go blind for a moment. Everything turns white. I find myself back on Typhus Prime, just outside Court Norum. The ground is erupting around me from the orbital bombardment that paved our way into the rebel citadel. After a few moments, I realize I'm no longer on the muddy fields of Typhus Prime, but in a gray desert, and the explosions are from bombs being dropped from around me. My whole body shudders. Part of me knows it isn't real, but my senses tell me that it's happening right now. The hallucination starts to fade, and I vomit the gruel over the floor and collapse sideways, slumping against the cubicle wall. A moment before my sight returns to normal, I see and hear something indescribable. It's a mess of confusing colors, clashing with each other, amid a torrent of high pitched screams. I sit there for a few moments, panting heavily. The pain subsides to a dull throb. It's happening more regularly, and it scares the hell out of me. In fact, I'm terrified of what the truth might be. The warped dreams, Inquisitor Oriel's hints during the Brightsword assassination, the moments of instinct in combat when I seem to know what's going to happen a couple of seconds before it does. I have to face an awful fact. I think I'm a psyker. What makes it worse is that Oriel knows, and maybe the Colonel too. I can't understand why the Inquisitor has let me be. I always thought that rounding up untrained psychers like me was their reason for being. I don't know what worries me more, the thought that I might get turned into the Inquisition for being a witch, or the idea that for some reason Oriel and Schaefer are using me for something else. There's no way I can let the rest of the platoon find out. They didn't kill themselves. They didn't kill me themselves, and they'd be sure to use the Colonel. Wow. Okay. If they didn't kill themselves, they'd be sure to make the Colonel take action. The problem is, with these seizures striking me more often, it's only a matter of time before the truth comes out, or perhaps I'm just going mad. It is entirely possible, I suppose, given what we've been through. I instinctively touched the scar on the side of my head, a reminder of the operation I had. Some bastard drilled into my skull to release a dangerous buildup of vapors, then dug around my brain with a knife for good measure. I'm no medico, but surely messing around with someone's head like that can't be good for them. But the hallucinations had started before then, and who in the hell knows what's happening up there? Suitably calmed, I stand up and straighten my uniform. Opening the cubicle door, I glance around and find the others are still in the mess. It's only been a minute, probably less since the attack began. I open the storage cupboard and quickly mop up the floor before tidying everything away and leaving the ablutions chamber. As far as I'm walking past the mess on my way to the colonel's office to give my daily report, the others begin to file in on their way to the bunk room. They got an hour to prepare for the colonel's inspection, and they're certainly good enough to be ready in half that, earning themselves a bit of leisure time. Lori is one of the last to leave and looks at me questioningly. Are you all right, Kage? She asks. You're looking pale. I laugh, perhaps slightly too hard. The thing is, Lori's about as pale as you can get. Her skin is absolutely white, as is her short cropped hair. Her pale blue eyes look into mine for a second, and I meet her stony gaze. Sorry, I say, glancing away for a heartbeat. She doesn't say anything, but just stands there looking at me in that cool manner she has. Then she turns away and walks off without another word. I watch her. Any other man might have admired the swing of her hips, but I remember her gouging out the eye of a man who had touched her, so I can safely say I've got no interest in any kind of bunkroom tricks. It was odd meeting her again when I came on board. I thought she had been dead for the previous 2 years. The last time I had seen her before then, she had run off after her brother, who had gotten his brains blown out while we were in Court Norm. I had heard gunfire and assumed she had died too. Turns out that Inquisitor Oriel, another person to have arisen like a ghost from the ashes of Court Norm, had brought her out of safety. She had worked for the Oriel as a go-between for him and the Imperial Guard during the setup for the Bright Sword mission, and after talking to her, she confirmed that I really had seen her coming down the assault ramp of the lander. Apparently, according to the Colonel, she requested to rejoin the Last Chancers. I think she has a death wish, perhaps because she lost Lauren. Whatever it is, she's got a haunted look about her. And I haven't seen her smile once in the last year. She performs well in training, excellently in fact, but she's dead inside. I can tell from her eyes. I feel a strange relief to find another of the Last Chancers. It had been troubling to me as to why I had survived when the rest of the team had ended up dead. I got over it, of course, but seeing her, I felt comforted that someone else was still alive, who knew what we had done. Someone else who knows about the 3 million men, women, and children we killed. Someone else who understands just what it is the Last Chancers do and why we have to do it. I remember trying to explain it to the last squad about how a soldier has to act and learn to kill everything without thought or remorse. This time, I haven't bothered to try. They'll either figure it out or they'll die. Either way, I'm not thinking of them as my soldiers anymore. That was my mistake last time, thinking that the squad was mine. They never were. We're all the colonel's meat for the grinder, and he doesn't think twice about any of us, not even me. When I first read this series, and in fact the subsequent times I read the series too to myself, I was kind of annoyed that Lori survived. I mean, her entire character is basically just being a twin, and now she's like a twin without a twin. So I guess yeah, that I guess being a twin without a twin is cool. But she's grown on me mainly because now I don't have to like do a new voice for her, or new personality or anything. I just remember who she was. So I can appreciate now why the writers don't always just write in new characters. Why some characters have to survive improbable odds, because otherwise there would be such a huge circus. Like this, there would be like a never-ending circus. The colonel looks at me from behind his desk. His ice-shard eyes bore into me as I give my daily report. As usual, he's in his dress uniform, braids and everything. He sits erect in the high-backed chair, arms folded across his broad chest. "And how about discipline, Kage?" he asks. "Gorn broke Tallpass's nose last night for stealing his bootlaces," I say, staring over the colonel's left shoulder. "His bootlaces?" asks the colonel, leaning forward and resting his hands neatly on his desk. "Topaz can't help herself," I explain. "Even when they've got nothing except their uniform, she can't stop herself from taking something. And Gorn is a bully, sir, through and through. He knows he's bigger than she is, and all he had to do was ask for him back. But he asked with his fist." I met Sheffier's gaze. He's still staring at me intently. Nearly a year with them, and you cannot stop them from stealing from each other or fighting? He says. "Well, sir, If you had given me a stormtrooper regiment, I guess they'd be happy and smiling, I say. As it is, they're the dregs of your gulag, and some of them won't be changed. But every single day? Says the colonel, showing his frustration. 5 have been killed while they sleep. 2 in stand up fights, and twice that number have spent a month or more in the apothecarium. It is simply not good enough, Kage. They're stuck on the ship in the middle of warp space with absolutely nothing, I say, trying to keep my voice even. Even if they weren't criminals, they would be slitting each other's throats, or their own after all this time. There's nothing I can do about Topaz, short of cutting off her hands. But you can deal with Gorin, says the colonel, still staring straight at me. His expression hasn't changed a bit, not outwardly, but his meaning is suddenly very clear. I've tried everything in the regulations detailed for the type of infractions committed, I say. His stare doesn't waver for a second. Yes, sir, I say with a vicious smile. Yes, I can deal with Gorin with your permission. You have my full permission, Cage, to deal with the situation as you see fit, the colonel says, motioning me to leave with a flick of his head. I want to see a sharp improvement in discipline. I snap to attention and bring up the smartest salute I've done in a long time. I spin on my heel and march to the door. One thing, Cage, says the colonel, and I turn back. Bear in mind that the infirmary is not very well equipped, and the platoon is already at minimum strength after that incident with Morgan. I'll bear that in mind, sir, I say with a sharp nod before opening the door and stepping out. As I turn and close the door, I catch a glimpse of the colonel leaning the chair into its back legs, a satisfied smile on his face. It's 2 more days before Goran steps out of line again and gives me the opportunity to do what I've been waiting for the past 6 months. It's evening meal, and his squad, under Sergeant Candlewick, is up on their dinner duty. He short rations Brownie Dunmore's dish, and the heavy weapons man starts to complain. Although it's slush, it's the only thing we can have, and so I see Brownie's point. Don't ask me why they call him Brownie. His real name is Bryn. I should ask him sometime. Anyways, things get a little heated over the counter, and Brownie ends up slapping his dish at Goran. Goran's a big guy, nearly a head taller than me. He looms over Brownie and takes a swing with his heavy ladle, smacking Brownie straight across the face. As Goran steps over the counter, scattering pans and dishes everywhere, I make my move. I ghost right up to Dunmore, nobody noticing me. Brownie's not seriously hurt. He's just smarting. Goran swings the ladle back for another attack. Goran, who once battered one of his squad mates to death over a game of cards, knows how to use his size well. So do I. Stepping forward, I drive the extended fingers of my right hand into Goran's windpipe, and he drops the ladle and clutches both hands to his throat. I drive my right boot in the side of his admin, low enough not to crack any ribs, winding him. My left hook catches him above the right eye. I don't break his jaw or nose, but the blow opens up a cut that bleeds down his face. Roaring, he takes a swing at me, which I duck. Then I turn and move a leg sweep that crashes on the back of his right knee, sending him tumbling. I let him get up and take a couple of swings at me. His face is contorted with anger. He's fast as well as big, and I have to stay on my toes, swaying back out of his long reach. Then I step inside his guard to hammer my right fist square into his chin, diving his jawbone up into his face and stunning him. He swings another right at me. A short strike to the back of my neck knocks him down into the metal decking. He lies there groaning, clutching his dislocated shoulder. Fix him up, I say to Kage, who's the most adept at blood work. Sergeant Candlewick, will you excuse Trooper Gorham from heavy duties for the next 2 days? The platoon looks at me with a mixture of shock, awe, and joy. It's time you all started acting like soldiers, not a pack of wild dogs, I tell them. Walking to the door, I pull out the small book of regs and tear it in half. I can't read it anyways. I always have to ask Lori to find things for me. I'm the top dog, and anyone who steps out of line from now on answers to me. You were convicted under imperial law, and now you're under cage law. Understand? They murmur. Most of them are looking at the floor, avoiding my gaze. I think you'll find a sling in the infirmary, I say to Kage as I march smartly out of the room to the colonel's office. Needless to say, the platoon is on its best behavior for the next few days. Topis manages not to steal anything. Goran gives me as wide a berth as possible, and I suspect that even Juka has stopped spitting in the gruel when he's on food detail. Riding the mood, I give them solid drill for the next 2 days, marching them up and down the training chamber and getting the sergeants to bellow the orders. I never liked square bashing myself when I was a trooper, but now I realize it's one of the best ways to show who's in charge. I say a word, a sergeant shouts a command, and they do whatever they've been told to do. In battle, unquestioning obedience is essential for survival. No pondering their rights and wrongs, no wondering whether I'm right. They do what they're told, because I'm in charge. I exhaust them for the 2 days, drilling them until the sergeants are hoarse. I give them the next day as rest. Of course, with only half of them being able to bunk at any one time, they have to find their own diversions. A lot of them sit in the mess, swapping stories. I remember doing that, telling the same old tales of the same people again and again, and listening to the same old tales from the same old people as if I'd never heard them. I listen to it all. I hear where they're from, what they did before joining up, their first love, their first battle, the wound that still gives them a little trouble when it's cold or wet. All of this, the same. I've met a lot of soldiers in my time, but underneath the skin, the uniform, they're pretty much all the same, even these wretches. In fact, I've come to believe the last chances are probably the ideal soldiers. I can understand why the colonel finds us so useful. Every man or woman who joins the Imperial Guard know that they can never go home. They are shipped for months to a war on a world they probably never heard of. They might carry the memories of their home world and their family, but that reality is that they will never see either again. A regiment that serves well, does its time, fights its campaign, is often allowed to retire with honors. Some make their home where they have fought. Others join an explorator fleet and conquer a new planet in the name of of Holy Terra and the Emperor. Those are the ones that survive, of course. Us last chancers get to live if we do well. It's plain and simple. If we do poorly, we'll die in battle. And that's the chance that every soldier takes. Our regiments aren't even our homes anymore. I have no idea where the Olympus 24th Lifeguard is now. They might be garrisoning the backwater hole called Styges, where I ran foul of my sergeant, causing me to be where I am now. Perhaps Styges was invaded, perhaps not. Frankly, I don't give a damn. All they have left is the last chancers and the colonel. No family, no friends, no home, just comrades who would steal their teeth for a meal or slice out their guts to look at the pretty colors. But they're the only comrades we've got, so they tell stories. The stories the last chancers tell always have a final chapter. It always ends with what they do wrong. The colonel. Take Bryn Dunmore, for example. His sin was pride. He's a top heavy weapons expert, trained as part of the engineer corps from Strala. From heavy stubbers to las cannon and mortars, he can use them all. Problem is, he had to prove just how good he was. He took a bet that he couldn't use an anti-tank missile to shoot down an airplane. He proved that he could, but unfortunately the plane shot down was an Imperial interceptor returning from a sortie. They threw him in the lockhouse faster than the plane came down. I really should find out why he's called Brownie. My musings are interrupted when klaxons began to sound. Reverberating off the metal walls, I leapt to my feet and head out the door towards the wardroom. The colonel meets me halfway, his eyes dangerously narrowed. Send the platoons to the armory, he snaps. Meet me on the upper deck. I don't ask questions. I just turn and shout at the squad to move out of the armory. I follow them down the spiral staircase to the deck below. Erasmus already has the doors open and is handling out the lasguns and shotguns. I notice that the provosts are nowhere to be seen. I reach the upper deck at the head of the platoon and hear shots roaring out and ringing off the walls. We're halfway along the central access corridor that runs the length of the ship. It is about 300 meters long. A few provosts stand at the far end, firing through the doors into the chamber beyond. There's a bright red flash, and one of them comes flying backwards, trailing smoking innards. He crashes some 20 meters in front of us, screaming his head off. Kage! I snap, dashing past the stricken commissariat trooper. The colonel emerges from a side chamber just before I reach the double doors at the end. With him is Vandakar Kelf, one of the ship's navigators. He's tall and thin, with the distinctive bulbous skull of a navigator. He wears a silk scarf tied tightly across his forehead. He swishes past me in a skin-tight green suit under a white robe and looks down the corridor. What's happening? I ask over the shouts of the provost and the cannonade of the shotguns. It is forelaying, says Kelth, turning back to me. He's referring to the other surviving navigator. The third had started with us, Bunjern, Adath. He went crazy and threw himself out of an airlock 6 months into the journey. Gone mad? I asked the colonel. Worse, he replies. Out of the corner of my eye, I catch a glimpse of the far chamber, which is the landing that leads up to the tower where the navigators stay, doing whatever it is they do to steer a ship to the warp space. There are 2 provosts on the ground, lying in a crumpled heap, blood leaking from their visored helmets. 3 of the ship's crew are on the ground next to them, one of them a smoldering burnt husk, the other 2 missing limbs. I see Forling standing at the foot of the steps. He's naked, except for a few tatters of bloodied white robes that hang from bony protrusions jutting from his flesh. His fingers have fused into long claws. There are scraps of flesh hanging from their tips. A provost steps in the breach and fires a shotgun, obscuring any view. A moment later, the sound of lots of bones snapping at the same time echoes down the hall, and the provost collapses, crumpled in on itself. Possession? I say, horrified, turning to Kelth. How? Take it down, the colonel says, ignoring my question. Squad 1 with me, I shout, running down the corridor. Squad 2 covering fire. Squad 3 ready for reserve or rear guard. I hear Kelth shouting something behind me, but I don't register what he says until I burst into the room, the shotgun booming in my grasp. Don't look into his eye, the navigator warns. Don't what? I ask, instinctively looking at the possessed navigator's face. His mouth is open in a grin. Blood is streaming from toothless gums. His eyes are deep red, the color of fresh blood. It's then that I realize what Kelth had said. I always wondered what it was that navigators kept hidden under the scarves of bandanas. Now I know, and I wish I didn't. In the midst of Forlang's forehead is a swirling vortex about the size of a normal eye, but it extends forever and into impossible depths. To my right, Topus screams. The sound echoes shrilly off the walls. There's the sound of a las blast, and parts of bloody matter splatter across my face and arm as she blows her own brains out, just in front of me. Goran falls to his knees as Forling turns towards him. A blast of rippling energy rips out of the possessed navigator's third eye, enveloping Goran's chest. His ribs splay outwards, tearing through the skin and flinging ruptured organs across the floor. Forlang turns his eye on me. I look straight at it, into that swirling maelstrom. I feel a hot wind on my face and hear the sound of crackling flames close by. The vortex turns red. Steam drifts out of the impossible orb. I look away and bring up the shotgun. Forlang's face is twisted in a contortion of rage, which is replaced by a look of abject terror as I stare back at him. "The fires await!" he screams at me, his voice unnaturally caked and high-pitched. "Damnation will burn through your soul!" I pull the shotgun trigger, and the shell takes Forling square in the chest, knocking him to the ground. He gets to one knee and looks at me. "It is not only the angel that ascends on wings!" he shrieks. "Shut up," I snarl, hoping the others think that he's raving. I pump another round into the chamber and advance, shooting him in the chest again. Bone and muscle fly into the air, but he's still shouting at me. 3 more shells, the last into his face. Stop him from moving. He's not dead, though. I don't know how I can tell. Perhaps just instinct. Perhaps something more sinister. The colonel appears next to me, bolt pistol in his hand, followed swiftly by Kelth, who sweeps past me and runs up the steps of the navigator's pilaster. He returns quickly with a black hood, which he pulls over the pulped remains of Forlang's head. "He's not dead," I say, and Forlang looks over his shoulder at me, his dark eyes glittering. "Yes, he is," he says, standing up and taking a step towards us. "But the thing still dwells in the carcass. How do we destroy it?" "We cannot, not here," says the navigator. "I have a chamber, a special cell. I can keep it there until we jump back to the Materium." "Do you need any assistance?" the colonel asks, stepping towards the twitching corpse. "No," snaps Kelth, stepping in front of Colonel and barring his way. "I will deal with this. Do not intervene." The colonel looks as if he's going to argue and then turns away. "Notify me when you are done, and I'll have the bodies cleared away," Schaefer says, looking at me as he walks out of the room. "Clear out, platoon," I say. "Last squad, ready for roll calls on gristle duty." More than ever, it's a blessing, a relief, to jump out of warp space. Warp travel is the most dangerous thing a man can do, so I give an even longer prayer than usual to the Emperor for delivering me safe and sound into real space. We still have no idea where we are, and the colonel is not forthcoming. For another 8 days, we travel in system before the colonel tells us to turn out for disembarking. We assemble in the docking bay, eager to find out where we are. When the doors open, we walk across the threshold into a spacious airlock, and the ship's boarding gates close up behind us. The air that comes in is fresh and chill, a welcome relief for the others. After a long wait, the inner doors open and the colonel leads us in. Waiting for us is a commissar, peak cap low over his eyes, a data slate in one hand. He talks quietly with the colonel for a moment before turning and walking down the corridor. We trail after him, exchanging questioning glances. We're aboard an orbiting station of some sort, that's for certain. The corridors are of dull, unpolished metal, and here and there are signs of fighting, with blast and burn marks on the floor, walls, and ceiling. There are old bloodstains on the grain of the floor, though everything else is polished clean. Some of the corridors are crudely barricaded, and the occasional blast door dropped across our paths means that the commissars will have to take us on long loops through the blockages to get where we're going. "Hull integrity checks," the commissar explains as he sees us looking through the block gangways. I exchange knowing glances with the other members of the platoon, and we swap raised eyebrows and shrugs. It's no surprise, really. We were expecting a war zone after all, judging by the time it took us to get here after dropping from warp space. This is near the outer edge of the system, wherever that is. I see jury-rigged generators attached to cabling that spills from broken ceiling tiles, and along one stretch, broken fans clink against internal ventilators through shattered grills. After a few moments, the commissar opens large double doors emblazoned with the imperial eagle, and we step into a low auditorium. The commissar makes his way to the pedestal at the front, while the colonel waves us to sit down at the benches. When we're settled, Schaefer joins the commissar. Armageddon, the colonel says, looking at each of us in turn. There are groans from some of the others. Even out on the eastern fringe, you have heard what is happening here. To bring us up to date with the facts, Commissar Gret has compiled a briefing. The colonel looks at Gret and nods before taking a seat on the front bench next to Candlewick Squad. 3 Terran years ago, the Orcs returned to Armageddon, the commissar says, turning down at the data slate. Led by the warlord, Gazkul Mag Uruk Thraka, a large invasion force comprising of hundreds of warbands entered the Armageddon system. Aboard hulks and smaller vessels, they swarmed in system and were engaged by Imperial Navy warships. However, we could not prevent a mass landing. Sporadic reinforcements have arrived over the years, some of them destroyed, but others get through. We do not know how, but orcs from hundreds of days of journeying around Armageddon are being drawn to this world. The colonel stands up at this point and turns to faces. The surface of Armageddon is one large war zone, he tells us, one hand resting on the hilt of his power sword. A hive world. For several thousand years, Armageddon is a major manufacturing link in this sector, and its survival is paramount to neighboring sectors. This is one of the largest military campaigns in recent history, and is certainly centered on this single system. He sits down again and looks to Gret to continue. The commissar pauses for a moment to look at Schaefer before continuing. As well with this recent invasion, our forces on Armageddon must contend with indigenous feral orc populations, which have remained since the first invasion 50 years ago, he says, standing stock straight with his hands resting lightly on the lectern. Located in the equatorial jungles, on the mountain ranges, these tribes forayed forth in considerable numbers to engage our reserves, hamper logistics, and generally stifle our efforts to destroy orc landing sites. One hive has been destroyed. The others are heavily contested. He glances at the colonel, who nods and stands up again. Armageddon is the most militarized planet you will ever have encountered, Schaefer says. The orcs number in their millions, as down to our armies. And such an epic conflict, confusion, and disorder are the norm, and we will be looking to our devices for the completion of our mission. The details of that mission will be related to you at an appropriate time, but I will tell you now that you are to minimize contact with the Imperial forces on Armageddon. Our presence is deemed secret, and any of you who divulge any information regarding our presence will be executed immediately. The same applies to the contents of this briefing. Having given us this stern reminder of our duty, the colonel sits down and folds his arms. Gret clears his throat and continues. We thought Gazkul was already dead after the first invasion, but we were wrong, he says, his eyes and gaze steady. We believe now that he retired to his stronghold in the Golgotha sector to regroup his forces and plot his return. As bold and huge as his first attack was, it was nothing compared to what was to come 57 years later. There are some, myself and Colonel Schaefer included, who think that this first invasion was merely to test our defenses. It was nothing more than a reconnaissance, only performed on a planetary scale. He pauses to let this information sink in. Basically, this is no dumb orc we're dealing with here. But who actually has the presence of mind to plan, investigate, and to scheme? I begin to wonder what we're here for, and I'm starting to get a good idea what it might be. Roughly 30 years ago, on Buka 3, our base was annihilated by missiles fired from an orc base hit on an asteroid. Gray continues. The asteroid remained undetected before this attack, and we have now realized that this is the first test that we now dub rock forts. They continue to play a pivotal role in this war, providing transport and fortification that can be landed on the surface. I think we can skip to recent history, says the colonel. You only need understand that Gazgul and a later warlord known as Nazdreg systematically tested their weapons and tactics against a variety of targets over several decades. Would you like to continue the briefing with the start of the invasion itself? Of course, Gray says with a nod. He is possibly the politest commissar I have ever met. But then again, always in the middle of a fight, one way or another, whether I've met one before. After the near loss of Armageddon during the first invasion, an investigation was launched to look at its defenses by all aspects of the Inquisition and the Departmental Monitorium, Imperial Guard, Imperial Navy, and Adeptus Mechanicus. Given the importance of the system, it was recommended that they be seriously improved. Naval command was transferred to the Armageddon system, and the naval facility of St. John's Dock was rebuilt and expanded to accommodate all classes of interstellar warship. We escalated 3 monitor stations on the edge of the system, and this is the Mannheim, where there are 2 others, Dante and Yarick. The other orbital and ground munitions bases and forces were substantially bolstered. In addition, a ruling council representing any imperial organizations was convened to govern the planet. The previous imperial commander, Hermann von Straub, has disappeared at the end of the war. It is believed at the time that von Straub may have fled to avoid the attention of the Inquisition regarding his less than loyal conduct during the invasion, says the colonel, stroking his chin. As it turns out, that was true. But he had actually sided with Gazgul. Although his knowledge of the details of the system's defenses was outdated, there is little doubt his intelligence regarding our general strategic and military methods aided Gazgul in his planning. Schaefer waves great to continue, and the commissar scowls. It's only for a moment, but I notice. It is the first sign of irritation at the colonel's interruption. I bet the commissar doesn't even know what we're here for, or why he needs to act as a school teacher to a bunch of penal legionnaires. It began perversely enough, and I suspect not entirely by coincidence, on the day of the feast of the Emperor's Ascension, Great says, his expression sour. Monitor Station Dante transmitted a hurried message warning that over 50 orc cruisers and several hundred escort vessels had entered the system before the transmission was cut. We dispatched several battleships and their attendant task forces. A series of naval engagements took place. Against overwhelming numbers of the orcs, Admiral Perro's forces were gradually turned back in order to preserve ships for an extended campaign. It was immediately evident that this was no simple raid, though we did not realize at first that this was the beast that had returned. Great rubs a hand over his face. Then he pulls a handkerchief from the pocket of his greatcoat and wipes away his sweat. Even with his training and experience, it's hard for him to stay focused. He was obviously there when the attack occurred. It took the orcs 3 weeks of battle as they orbited Armageddon, bombarding St. John's dock into its uselessness while they were advancing. Great continues. The landing itself happened after a 3-day battle, but by then we were too late. It wasn't long before every hive was besieged. Our forces were battling merely to survive, and there was no thought of any counteroffensive. And so it has been for 3 years, the colonel concludes, standing up again, ignoring Great's irritated stare. The lines have moved back and forth, but there has been little advance since the invasion was stifled in the last few weeks of fighting. We cannot afford to let up for a second, and the orcs are never going to leave of their own accord. We are one of a number of strategies being employed to counter the orcs and break the deadlock in the Imperium's favor. It is no exaggeration to say that our mission could decide the fate of Armageddon. Something that's important about this briefing is it's one thing to actually understand the 40K lore, but if a person really wants to understand it to another level, if they want to take that understanding, they actually want to create fiction for 40K, which is very easy to do, very fun to do, actually. They'll be able to do it consistently, because the thing is most of 40K is guarded behind a wall, like a facade, and that wall and that facade, it seems like it's getting smaller and shorter, and it seems like there's more people, and that's true, but there's just nothing on the other side. There's just not a whole lot left on the other side anymore. So I'm speaking of Old Hammer, or I guess Middle Hammer is what the old folks call it. I'm speaking of more Middle Hammer than anything else when I say that it's a game in itself, not just to understand Warhammer, but to understand what the denizens of Warhammer understand. I mean, it's easy to hate the Tau and hate the Eldar, but how many of them have ever seen an Eldar or a Tau and lived to tell a tale? And the thing about Chaos too, right, is Chaos was meant to be a secret. It was always meant to be a secret before the Crusade, after the Crusade, during the Horus Heresy. It was meant to be a secret, and now I'm fairly certain that everyone knows about Chaos, but they shouldn't, because it would just break everything apart. Another fun fact, right? The Middle Hammer versus New Hammer is they talk about the Imperial Guard in here. They don't reference the Astra Militarum, and I'll tell you why. Okay, during the Horus Heresy, it was the Imperial Army, all right, the Imperial Navy, and the it was all just called the Imperial Army. The Navy and the ground forces was just called the Army. That was it. But Royal Dorn decided that it should be split between the Guard and the Navy. Okay, the Imperial Guard and the Imperial Navy. All right. I understand the Astra Militarum isn't the Imperial Navy. I understand the delineation there. But there's almost like an implication that the Navy is also roped into the Astra Militarum, because they have the stormtroopers, they have tech priests, they have all these different things. But that's the great thing about Warhammer. That really is the fantastic thing. Is even though I'm really checked out of a lot of the new lore and all that, the old stuff is still there, and I dare say it has gotten better with age.